Hello and welcome to myfinanceteacher.org. Bitcoin is down. It dropped all the way from 8,800 to under 8,000. What is going on and what's likely to happen next? Let's talk about that. Before we continue, let me remind you guys to subscribe to the channel if you haven't and click that bell notification. Thanks a lot. I don't usually pay that much attention to the news unless they are quite important, because there might be some relevance to fundamental analysis in the most important news. But a recent Bitcoin news is kind of interesting, reporting that a South Korean website was taken down by the US and local Korean authorities. The most interesting part of the news for me, specifically in terms of investments, is these few words. The authorities were actually following the Bitcoin trail. Blockchain, as you know, is open to the whole world to look at transactions. So if you are interested in privacy for your investments, you might want to do some research on how to improve your privacy on the publicly available Bitcoin blockchain. And you'll find out that things like, say, CoinJoin on some specialized wallets might help a lot. And in future, if there is some demand, I might talk about what you can do to improve your privacy in your Bitcoin transactions. For now, though, let's look at the technicals for Bitcoin. In the last video, I mentioned there was a chance that we've seen this 2-month cycle low in Bitcoin at the very late September, very early October. Since that video, however, Bitcoin price has only increased from around 8,200 to about 8,800. And it's now down just under $8,000. We did consider a possibility of lower prices within that risk-reward ratio we mentioned. And personally, I'm still holding those long positions on Bitcoin. Of course, in hindsight, it would have been nice to sell at 8,800 and enter again sometime soon once we confirm if early October low was the low for that 2-month cycle low. But to be honest, I'm a little bit too much fond of Bitcoin and I buy more often than I sell. I have a long-term hodling position and I only trade with a small share of BTC. Moving forward though, if over the next few days Bitcoin does manage to break below recent lows, the question then would be to consider whether the previous 2-month cycle is stretching a little bit or whether we are in the next 2-month cycle which has already failed, creating a lower low. And given that we would still have a lot of time within the normal duration of that cycle, we would probably see somewhat considerably lower prices. For example, this 6,000 area has been support resistance for a while last year in 2018, so it's not inconceivable to retest 6,000. That is if the current 2-month cycle fails and gives us a lower low. By the way, looking at history, this drop from 6,000 down to 3,000 looks a lot like recent drop from 10,000 down to 8,000. And last time around, we didn't see much continuation of the downtrend. Instead, as I sometimes mention, the periods of high volatility are replaced by periods of low volatility. We've had quite some volatility recently, so it's also possible Bitcoin just goes sideways for a while. Maybe something like a shallow low over the next 2-month cycle, before we see much more volatility likely on the upside in the advancing phase of the following 2-month cycle. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's hard to say which of those scenarios is more likely. For me, still a marginally, just a little bit more likely scenario is possibly a continuation of this new 2-month cycle, retesting and breaking slightly above that resistance zone of 9,000, another zone at 9,100, and that 50-day moving average. As I mentioned before, even in the midst of the bear market, these 2-month cycles did poke through the 50-day moving average. So despite recent weakness in Bitcoin, I think it's slightly more likely that we're gonna stay in an uptrend for another few weeks in Bitcoin. After all, this RSI is somewhat recovering as well. And looking at MACD, after crossing into bullish territory just around the time of the previous video on Bitcoin, MACD hasn't really crossed back into bearish yet. So there is still a chance of recovery. But the last word in this video would be still, remember about those stop losses, don't lose much capital. Let me know what you guys think on Bitcoin and good luck in your trades.